The suitcase hit the wet grass before Wren Ashby did. She stood on the porch in her socks. October wind moved through the old maple at the edge of the yard, and the leaves came down in slow, weightless circles, the way they do when no one is paying attention to them. Her stepmother stood behind the screen door. That face, tight at the jaw, smooth at the forehead, the particular stillness of a woman who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. Behind her, half swallowed by the hallway dark, stood Gerald Ashby, one hand on the doorframe, eyes on the floorboards. He had not looked at his daughter in 3 weeks. He did not look at her now. Sylvia Crane Ashby spoke. Her voice was soft. That was the particular cruelty of it. She did not shout. She did not raise a hand. She spoke in the calm, instructional tone a person uses when addressing a problem that has already been resolved. You always land on your feet, sweetheart. Girls like you always do. Then she turned the deadbolt. One small sound, final as the lid on something sealed for good. The porch light went out a moment later. Wren stood in the dark and did not move. She was 16 years old. It was a Tuesday in October. Her mother had been dead for 9 months and 2 weeks. And the woman her father had married 4 weeks after the funeral had just put her out of the only home she had ever known, with a single garbage bag of clothes and a shoebox of her mother's letters tied with a piece of green kitchen twine. She did not cry. She thought she ought to. Somewhere in the back of her mind she heard her mother's voice, soft and a little amused the way it sometimes was. "Oh, sweetheart, you can cry. It is all right." But the tears did not come. There was only a great quiet inside her chest, like the inside of a church on a weekday morning when no one is there and the candles have all gone out. She picked up the suitcase. The handle was cold. The wet grass had soaked through her socks, and she could feel the chill climbing her ankles into the bones of her feet. She walked down the gravel drive toward the road, and the gravel cut through the thin soles of her shoes, and she kept walking anyway because standing still was going to break her in half. She did not know it yet, but in the pocket of her mother's old barn jacket, the one she had grabbed off the hook by the back door because it still carried the faint smell of paint and lavender that had belonged to Eleanor Ashby. There was something her mother had pressed into her palm on a quiet afternoon 7 weeks before she died. A folded square of paper, a hand-drawn map, a small square marked in faded pencil at the end of a road Wren had never been down, and 2 words in her mother's handwriting underlined twice. Grandmother's place. She had forgotten about it. She had folded the paper into her jewelry box at 14, and then the long months of her mother's dying had come, and the funeral and the wedding. 4 weeks after the funeral that her father had stood through, with his eyes on the floor the way he stood in the hallway tonight, the watercolors coming off the walls, the books going into cardboard boxes, her mother's rocking chair sitting at the curb one Tuesday morning with a piece of cardboard taped to it that read "Free." She had forgotten about the paper. She had forgotten about a great many things. She reached the end of the driveway and turned left because left was toward town, and she had no better idea than that. The wind picked up. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice, and then thought better of it and went quiet. The streetlights were thin and far apart, and she walked under them one by one, moving through pools of pale light and then back into the dark between them. She had walked almost a mile before something brushed against her hip, something inside the pocket of the barn jacket. A folded thing. She put her hand in. Her fingers closed around paper. She stopped in the middle of the empty road. Her breath came out in small white clouds. She stood there and she remembered. 2 years ago, a bright afternoon in late spring, her mother sitting up in the hospital bed with the window open and the curtain moving, and her hand already thin by then taking Wren's and pressing the folded paper into her palm. If anything ever happens, Emmy, if you are ever in real trouble, the kind your father cannot help with, you go to your grandmother's place. You do not tell your father. You do not tell anyone. You go. She had been 14. She had folded the paper. She had put it away. She had been afraid to take it out again because taking it out meant believing her mother was right to be afraid, and she had not been ready to believe that. She turned around. She walked back the full mile she had come. She went around the side of the house, past the trash cans, past the dried flower bed, where Eleanor had once grown sunflowers tall as the kitchen window. She stood under the window of her old bedroom. The latch had been broken since she was 12. Her father had never gotten around to fixing it. She slid the window up the same dry sound it had always made. And she climbed over the sill the way she had climbed in 100 times after babysitting the Hendrickson twins down the road. The room was no longer her room. The bed had been moved against the wrong wall. Her posters were gone. A folding craft table stood where her dresser had been covered in rolls of patterned fabric and a glue gun and a basket of artificial flowers. Wren looked at it for a moment. Then she moved to the closet. Her jewelry box was on the floor behind a stack of Christmas decoration boxes. She opened it. The paper was still inside, yellowed a little along the fold lines. She put it in her pocket without opening it. She climbed back out the window. She closed it behind her. She walked away from the house without looking back because she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was never coming back. Not to that house, not to that version of her life. Whatever was going to happen to her now, it was going to happen somewhere else. She unfolded the paper under the streetlight at the end of the block. Her mother had drawn it with care. A line for the state highway, a line for the county road, a line for a smaller road, unpaved, labeled Hollow Creek Road, a small square at the end of it, an X, 2 words underlined twice, and at the very bottom in small letters that looked like an afterthought key under the flat stone by the step. Wren stood under the light for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it back in her pocket and walked. The Greyhound station was 4 miles into town. She made it in just under 2 hours. Her socks were ruined by the time she got there. She bought a ticket to Calder County for $11, which left her with $89 in babysitting money she had been saving since July. Money she had been setting aside for a winter coat. She bought the ticket because Hollow Creek Road was somewhere out beyond the Calder County seat, and she did not have money for a taxi, and she did not have anyone she could call. The bus left at 1 in the morning. She sat in a window seat and watched the highway unspool under the headlights. She did not sleep. She thought about her mother. She thought about the smell of the barn jacket. She thought about her grandmother Miriam Ashby, who had lived alone in a stone cottage at the end of an unpaved track for the last 40 years of her life, and who had been buried in a country graveyard when Wren was 9 years old. She remembered that funeral better than she remembered her mother's. Her mother's funeral had been a blur of casseroles and women in dark dresses she did not know. Miriam's funeral had been small and quiet. Just Wren and Eleanor, and an old man in a flannel work jacket standing at the edge of an open grave under a row of sugar maples. The old man had shaken Eleanor's hand at the end and said something Wren had not fully understood at the time. Miriam was the last honest person I knew. Then he had walked away across the cemetery, and she had never seen him again, but she had thought about him sometimes over the years. The weight of his hand when he had reached down and shaken hers too, not with the bright, false cheerfulness adults usually applied to children, but with the sober nod of a man who recognized that she was a person and that her grief was real. The bus rolled on through the dark, and she thought about all of this, and she did not sleep. She got off at the Calder County seat at 3 in the morning, stood in the empty station with her suitcase, and looked at the map again. Hollow Creek Road was 9 miles out. There was no taxi stand. The station attendant had gone somewhere in the back. There was nothing but the fluorescent lights and the smell of old coffee and a clock on the wall that read 3:04. She walked. The county road was 2-lane and quiet at that hour. She walked along the shoulder with her flashlight swinging a small yellow beam over the gravel ahead of her. The air smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves. Somewhere far off, an owl called from a stand of dark timber, 2 notes and then silence. Somewhere farther off, a freight train moved through the night, its horn low and long and mournful. Wren walked between those 2 sounds and did not think about anything except the next step and the one after that. She reached the turn for Hollow Creek Road at nearly 4 in the morning. There was no sign. There was only a mailbox at the corner leaning slightly to the left, with a name painted on its side in letters so weathered they were almost gone. Ashby. She put her finger on the letters and felt the faint ridge of old paint. Then she turned and walked up the unpaved track into the trees. The cottage was exactly where the map said it would be. Small and square, set back in a clearing ringed by sugar maples that had dropped most of their leaves into a thick rust-colored carpet on the ground. The roof sagged at one corner. The windows were boarded. The front door was padlocked. She knelt at the bottom step and lifted the flat stone there, ordinary and smooth, the kind of stone you would not notice if you were not looking for it. The key was underneath, brass gone dull with years of damp, but it fit the padlock cleanly, as though it had been waiting. She turned it. The lock opened. She pushed the door. The hinges made a long, low sound that moved through the clearing and into the trees and then faded. The air that came out of the cottage was cold and still, and it carried something that stopped her where she stood on the threshold. Something she recognized before she could name it. A smell like cedar and lavender and old wood soap. Her grandmother. 7 years in the ground, and the house still held her the way stone holds the cold of winter long after winter has gone. Wren stepped inside. She set the suitcase down on the plank floor. She closed the door behind her. She stood in the middle of the dark room and let that smell come over her, and for the first time since her father had looked at the floor instead of at her, she let her knees give. She sat down on the cold hearthstones in front of the dead fireplace, and she put her hands over her face. She did not cry. The numbness was still there, solid and reliable. But something in her chest opened a little the way a closed hand opens when it is finally too tired to hold on. She sat like that until the first gray light came through the cracks in the boarded windows. The cottage had no electricity. There was a hand pump over a stone sink. There was a wood stove against the south wall and a deep stone fireplace built into the chimney that took up nearly half of it. There was a loft above her head reached by a narrow ladder, and up in the loft there was a bed under 3 folded wool blankets that smelled of cedar, and when she finally climbed up there, she pulled those blankets over herself and lay still and did not dream. She slept until mid-morning. When she came down, the light was coming gray through the boards over the windows, and the cottage felt less strange than it had in the dark. She took stock of things the way her grandmother had always told her to do, quietly and without rushing, starting from where she stood and moving outward. She primed the hand pump. The water ran rust-colored at first, and she let it run until it cleared, and then she cupped her hand under it and drank. It was the coldest, cleanest water she had ever tasted, like drinking from the heart of the earth itself. She found 3 cords of seasoned oak and maple in the woodshed behind the cottage. Her grandmother had laid them in the summer before she died 7 years ago, and 7 years of weather had not softened them. She carried armloads inside and built a fire in the stone fireplace. The chimney drew clean and strong, and the fire caught and climbed, and the cold that had been sitting in the cottage like a tenant for 7 years began slowly to pull back. She found her grandmother's spice tins on a shelf still labeled in Miriam's careful handwriting. Sage, thyme, dill. She found a tin of loose tea that had passed beyond being tea and become something closer to dust. She found 2 crackers in a waxed paper sleeve at the back of a cabinet and ate them sitting on the hearthstones with her knees drawn up watching the fire. On the mantel above the fireplace was a small frame photograph. She took it down and wiped the dust from the glass with her sleeve. Miriam Ashby, younger than Wren had ever known her, standing in front of the cottage in a long dress and an apron, a wooden bucket in one hand looking directly at the camera. Not smiling, not frowning. The expression of a woman who has work to do and intends to do it, and has no particular need for anyone else's opinion about that. Wren looked at her grandmother's face for a long time. Then she put the photograph back on the mantel and went to find more firewood. On the morning of the second day, she walked into Linen Hollow. Population 461 according to the sign at the edge of town. 1 stoplight, 1 square, a barber shop, a coffee counter with 3 stools, and a general store on the corner with the words Bradshaw and Sons painted in white letters on the front window letters that had been there long enough to fade at the edges. A bell rang when she pushed open the door. The store smelled of coffee and sawdust and the particular dry leather smell of work gloves that had been hanging on a peg for a season. A man behind the counter looked up. He was about 68 years old, though she would not learn that until later. He wore a flannel shirt the color of old brick and a wool cap pulled low. His hands rested on the counter, and they were the hands of a man who had spent 50 years working outside in every kind of weather, thick-knuckled and scarred and unhurried. His eyes were a pale, steady blue. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been half expecting for a long time and are relieved to finally see. She walked the aisles, box of matches, bag of rice, bag of dried beans, a cast iron skillet she could not quite afford but knew she would need, a sack of potatoes, a wedge of cheese wrapped in wax paper, a small box of black tea. She added it up in her head as she walked, and the total came in just under what she had, and that was as good as things could reasonably be. She brought everything to the counter. The man rang it up without hurrying and without speaking. When she set the money on the counter, he did not pick it up right away. He looked at her face. He looked at the barn jacket. He looked for a long, quiet moment at the cast iron skillet sitting on the worn wood between them. Then he said, "You are Eleanor's girl." She did not answer at first. She did not know how he knew. She did not know who he was. "Yes, sir," she said finally. "I am." He nodded, slowly the way men nod when something they have been waiting for has finally arrived. He did not smile. He picked up her money, counted out her change, and bagged the groceries in a brown paper sack with the deliberate care of a man who has done this every day for 40 years. He pushed the bag across the counter. Then he said, "Tell your grandmother hello." She looked at him. She thought for a moment that he was confused or perhaps simply eccentric in the way of people who have lived alone in small towns for too long. But his pale eyes were absolutely steady. There was nothing confused in them. "Sir," she said, "my grandmother passed 7 years ago this spring." "I know she did," he said. "Tell her anyway." She did not know what to say to that. He said, "My name is Cormac Eller. People call me Corm. I have the farm that runs up along the back of your grandmother's land. Have for 43 years. You walk back out to Hollow Creek Road. You turn left where the maples start. That is where I am. Day or night, you need anything, you come find me." He paused. "You are not the first Ashby woman to come down that road alone. You will not be the last." She walked the 9 miles back to the cottage with the groceries and Cormac Eller's words turning in her mind. She did not understand them. Not yet. But she understood that the old man had not been surprised to see her. Not even a little. It was as if some part of him had been listening all these years for the bell over the door to ring and for it to be a girl in a dead woman's barn jacket carrying a cast iron skillet she could barely afford. She cooked rice and beans over the coals that evening and ate sitting on the hearthstones and drank tea from a tin cup she found on a shelf. The food was hot and salty and the tea was strong and the fire held the cold off her back, and for about 6 minutes she felt something that was not grief and was not fear. Something that might in a different season of her life have been called peace. Then the headlights moved across the boarded windows. A brown sedan came up the track slowly, the way a vehicle moves on a road it does not know. It stopped in the clearing and a man got out. He was wearing a tie, which was the first thing she noticed. He had a manila folder under his arm and the resigned expression of a man who has a job to do and is getting it done. He knocked on the door 3 times. "Miss Ashby," she opened it a crack. "My name is Clifton Paxton, County Assessor's Office. I am going to need a moment of your time." She stepped outside and closed the door behind her and stood on the porch of the house her great-great-grandfather had built from creek stone and timber 135 years ago, and she listened to a man in a wrinkled tie tell her what was about to happen to it. The estate of Miriam Ashby, he said, had been opened for review 12 days ago on the petition of a party representing her father's wife. There was no will on file with the county clerk. Under state intestacy law, the property passed to the next surviving kin, which with Eleanor deceased meant her father. Her father had signed an instrument of sale. The buyer was a holding company registered in Delaware called Cedar Ridge Holdings. The closing was scheduled 41 days from today. Wren stood with her hands at her sides and listened to all of it. My grandmother left this property to my mother, she said, and then to me. Paxton looked at her. Something moved across his face, a small involuntary thing, the expression of a man whose paperwork did not include this particular complication. There is no will on file, Miss Ashby. She did not file it. That does not mean it did not exist. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his folder, then back up. I am not supposed to tell you this, he said, but this property has been in a kind of legal limbo for 7 years because your mother never opened probate. The affidavit filed 12 days ago states your grandmother died intestate. On that basis, the property is being administered to your father, who has signed the sale. He paused. Cedar Ridge Holdings has been acquiring properties in this valley for the past 4 years. He said it the way a man says a thing he wishes he were not saying. I am sorry, Miss Ashby. You have 41 days. He turned and walked back to his car and drove down the track, and the sound of the engine faded into the trees, and the clearing was quiet again. The sugar maples dropped another handful of leaves. The fire inside the cottage crackled once and settled. Wren stood on the porch and did not move until the cold drove her back inside. She lit the kerosene lamp the way Miriam had taught her when she was 7. Trim the wick, strike the match downward, cup the flame until it catches. Turn the wick up a 1/4 inch. Set the chimney back into place. The soft yellow light filled the cottage and pushed the shadows to the corners. She sat down at her grandmother's oak table, the single slab of old oak worn smooth by a century of use, and she opened the shoebox. 11 letters. She had read the first 3 in the weeks after Eleanor died, and then stopped because she could not bear any more. She had not opened the box since. She read them all that night. She read slowly because Eleanor had written slowly, and it seemed like the least she could do. The 4th letter was about Gerald, about the man he had been before grief hollowed him out, about the way he had carried Wren on his shoulders at the county fair when she was 3 and sung to her on long drives and laughed at things that were not particularly funny because he had a generous nature and he used it freely before the world taught him to be careful with it. The 5th was about Miriam, about the way she had stood in the doorway of this same cottage in 1971 when a man in a suit had come up the track asking about mineral leases and how she had looked at him for a long moment and then said this land is not for sale and had not moved from the doorway until he drove away. About the ledger, Miriam kept 1 entry per year every January 1st, as regular as splitting wood in September or canning tomatoes in August. A woman of practices. A woman who understood that the small things done faithfully across a lifetime become in the end the only things that last. The 6th letter was about Wren herself, about the particular quality of her stubbornness, which Eleanor wrote was not stubbornness at all, but a kind of rootedness that most people never develop a knowledge of where you stand and an unwillingness to be moved from it without very good reason. The 7th was about love, in the plain, unromantic sense her mother had always preferred love, as something demonstrated over years rather than declared in moments. The 8th letter was the 1. It was written on hospital stationery in a looser, larger hand. The medication had made Eleanor's fingers uncertain in those last weeks, and the letters were bigger and less even than her usual writing, but they were legible and careful, as though she had taken a great deal of time with them. Emmy, my girl, I need to tell you something about your grandmother I was never brave enough to say while I was well. Behind the chimney of the cottage on the outside back wall, your great-great-grandfather built a hollow course of stone. He came from people who did not trust banks or courts or any man who arrived on a horse wearing good clothes. He built the chimney so that 2 of the stones in the back could be removed, and behind them is a small dry vault. Your grandmother showed it to me when I was your age. She made me count the stones with her. 6 up from the ground, 3 in from the corner. The 6th and 7th stones come out together. Pull them straight toward you. They are heavier than they look. I do not know what is in the vault. Your grandmother would not show me. She only told me that it was the truth about this valley and the people who want to take it. She told me that the people who needed to find it would never come asking, because people who go around asking are never the people who need the truth. I am telling you now because I'm running out of time. I do not want it to be lost. If anything ever happens, Emmy, if you are ever standing in that cottage with nowhere else to go, you go behind the chimney. You find what she left. I love you. I love you. I love you, Mama. Wren read the letter 3 times. She folded it carefully along its original creases. She put it back in the box with the others. She sat at the table with the lamp burning and the fire behind her and the wind moving in the maples outside. Then she stood up, put on the barn jacket, took the flashlight, and went outside. The night was cold, and the stars were thick and close the way they get in the country when there are no town lights for miles. She walked around to the back of the cottage. The chimney rose against the dark tree line like the spine of something very old and very patient. Dark creek stone mortared with pale lines, the work of a man who had hauled those stones up from the water with a team of draft horses before anyone alive today was born. She put the flashlight under her arm. She knelt. 6 up from the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 3 in from the corner. 1, 2, 3. She put her palms flat against the stone. It was cold and rough, and it did not move. She pushed. Nothing. She pulled. Nothing. The mortar had been in place for 135 years, and it did not care about her urgency. For a long moment, she knelt in the wet grass behind her grandmother's chimney and felt something that was very close to despair. The thought that her mother had misremembered, that the stones had settled into themselves across a century and could not be moved by the hands of a 16-year-old girl in the dark, that the map had led her to a house, and the house had led her to a letter, and the letter had led her here to her knees in the wet grass, pulling at a wall that would not give. She rocked back on her heels. She let out her breath slowly. Then she leaned forward again. She closed her eyes. She thought about Eleanor's hand on the hospital stationery, the letters larger and less steady than they used to be. She thought about Miriam showing the same stone to Eleanor in some long-gone summer afternoon when Eleanor was the age Wren was now. She thought about the man who had placed these stones with his own hands when this valley was still mostly trees and silence, who had built a hiding place into the very bones of his home because he understood that someday someone was going to need it. She pulled. The stone shifted a fraction of an inch. A small grinding sound like a door that has not been opened in a very long time finally being asked. She pulled again with everything she had. The stone came out. It was heavier than she expected, and she had to set it down carefully on the wet ground beside her. The stone above it came out almost on its own, as though it had been waiting for the first to move. Behind them was a dark, rectangular hollow roughly the size of 2 shoeboxes stacked. The inside was lined with thin sheets of tin, blackened with age but still sound. The air that came out of it was cold and dry and smelled faintly of old wax. Inside the hollow was a metal box. Ammunition can, olive green paint. A single letter painted on the lid in white, faded but still legible. M for Miriam. She carried it back inside with both hands, set it on the oak table in front of the kerosene lamp, sat down in her grandmother's chair. For a moment she did not open it. She only looked at it. The handle worn smooth by a hand that had touched it decades ago. The letter on the lid painted carefully in some long ago afternoon by a woman who had been doing quiet, precise work her entire life, without asking anyone's permission or announcing her intentions to anyone who did not need to know them. Then she unlatched it. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a thick stack of papers wrapped in heavy waxed canvas and tied with brown twine. The second was a small leather-bound ledger, its cover worn soft as old skin. The third, at the very bottom, folded twice and sealed inside a waxed paper envelope, was a document with a blue paper backing and a notary seal pressed into the corner, and at the bottom, in the steady old-fashioned hand of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing, a signature. Miriam Eleanor Ashby. Wren read the heading 3 times before she let herself believe what she was holding. Last Will and Testament of Miriam Eleanor Ashby. Her grandmother had left a will. It had never been filed. It had never been seen by anyone except the woman who wrote it, and whoever had helped her write it. It had sat behind two chimney stones for 7 years, dry and untouched, waiting for a granddaughter nobody had thought to account for. Wren sat at her grandmother's table in the soft yellow light and put her hand flat on top of the will. Under her palm, she felt the weight of every quiet, deliberate thing Miriam Ashby had done in the last years of her life. The careful handwriting, the ledger entries on January 1st, the man at the funeral who had said she was the last honest person he knew, the woman in the cottage doorway in 1971 who had looked at a man with a check in his coat and said, "This land is not for sale," and had not moved until he left. She did not yet know about the trust. She did not know about the silica. She did not know about the lawyer in the county seat who had been waiting since she was 9 years old for her to walk through his door. All she knew sitting at that table in the middle of that October night was that the woman buried under the sugar maples had not been a simple countrywoman. She had been thinking. She had been keeping something. She had loved a granddaughter she had only known for 9 years, well enough to build her a door out of paper and stone, and leave the key exactly where a frightened girl in a dead woman's barn jacket would know to look. The 41 days had begun, and Wren Ashby was no longer running. Cormac Eller's truck was older than most of the trees on his property. It had a long bench seat covered in a wool blanket gone thin at the center from years of use, a cracked dashboard with a compass stuck to it that had not pointed true north in at least a decade, and a radio that received exactly one station, an AM channel 2 counties over, that played gospel music on Sunday mornings and farm reports every other day of the week. When Cormac turned the engine over at 7 in the morning, the farm report was reading soybean futures in a voice so flat and certain it sounded like a man describing weather on a planet he had never visited. Cormac turned it off. They drove east on the county road in silence. The hills rose and fell on either side. The maples were burning down to their last color, deep red, going to rust, going to brown, and the ones that had already let go stood bare and gray against the pale sky. Wren sat with the ammunition can on her lap and the barn jacket pulled close and watched the road. She had not slept after reading the will. She had sat at the oak table until the lamp burned low, and then she had climbed to the loft and lain under the cedar blankets, with her eyes open until the gray came back into the boarded windows. Then she had walked the 3 miles to Cormac's farm in the early morning frost, the ground hard under her feet, her breath coming out white. He had been in the kitchen when she arrived, coffee on, bacon in a cast iron pan. He had looked at her standing on his porch in the cold, and he had said simply, "You found it." Not a question. The statement of a man who had been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen and was not surprised that it finally had. She had nodded. He had stepped back from the door and said, "Come in," and that had been the whole of it. He did not ask what was in the box while she ate. He did not ask on the drive. He drove the way he did most things with a steady, unhurried attention, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have both understood that what is coming next is serious and are conserving themselves for it. After about 10 miles somewhere past a feed store with a hand-painted sign advertising new season hay, he cleared his throat. "Your grandmother," he said, "sat me down at my kitchen table one fall afternoon. Must have been 4 or 5 years before she passed. She said, 'Corm, if my daughter or her child ever comes to you with a box from the cottage, you take them to Harlan Voss. Nobody else. Not the courthouse clerk, not anybody at the assessor's office, not anyone in this valley who has been here less than 30 years. You drive them there yourself, and you sit with them, and you wait.'" He paused. His hands were steady on the wheel. "She said you do not ask what is in the box. She was very particular about that. She said it is between her and her daughter, or her and her daughter's daughter, and it is not the business of any neighbor, even one who loves them." Wren looked at the road ahead. "Why did she love me?" she said. "She only knew me for 9 years." Cormac was quiet for a long moment, long enough that 2 hills came and went, and the road curved through a stand of dark pine and came out the other side into open pasture. "Miss Ashby," he said, "Miriam did not love you for 9 years. She loved you for every year she was still breathing after you were born. I know because I watched her. I watched her split wood for winters she had no guarantee of seeing. I watched her drive into town every January in weather that would have kept a younger woman home just to make one entry in a ledger and drive back. She was not a woman who explained herself, but she was a woman who showed up. And showing up for 62 years in a row is not something you do for a person you only love a little. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The county seat was a town of about 9,000 people arranged around a brick courthouse with a clock tower that read 11 minutes slow and had for as long as anyone could remember. Cormac parked in front of a three-story commercial building across from the courthouse square. Red brick iron fire escapes, a hardware store on the ground floor. Beside the hardware store entrance was a separate door with a wooden staircase behind it. And at the top of the stairs, a frosted glass panel with gold lettering that had been applied sometime in the early 1960s and not touched since. Harlan Voss, attorney at law. The waiting room had two wooden chairs, a rubber plant that had survived longer than most law practices in the county, and walls paneled in dark wood that had darkened further with the decades. Behind a small reception desk sat a woman of about 70 with white hair and a low bun and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Cormac. Then she looked at Wren, and she set her pen down with a slow, deliberate care. "You must be Eleanor's girl." "Yes, ma'am." The woman took her glasses off. She folded them and set them on the desk in front of her and looked at Wren for a long moment over the surface of it. "He has been expecting you," she said, "since you were 9 years old." Then she stood up, walked to the inner office door, and knocked twice. A voice from inside said, "Send them in." She opened the door and Wren walked through. Harlan Voss was small. That was the first thing. Small and slightly stooped, with white hair thin across the top of his head and a suit jacket that hung on his frame the way a coat hangs on a peg. He was standing behind a wide oak desk covered in manila folders arranged in careful stacks, and he was watching her come through the door with eyes the color of river ice in February, pale and still and absolutely without sentiment. He did not smile. He said, "Miss Ashby, sit down," and he said it the way a person says a thing they have been waiting a long time to say and are ready for the waiting to be over. She sat. Cormac sat beside her. The old man behind the desk lowered himself into his chair with the slow care of someone whose joints had been arguing with him for some years now. "Tell me what you have brought me," he said. She set the ammunition can on the desk. She unlatched it and opened the lid. Harlan Voss looked inside. He looked for a long time without moving. Then he reached in with one careful hand and took out the will. He laid it on the desk. He took out the leather ledger. He took out the waxed canvas packet of papers and laid it on top. Then he sat back and looked at Wren across the desk. "I need you to tell me everything that has happened to you in the last several days," he said. "All of it. From the beginning. And I need you to be precise." She told him. She told him about the porch and her socks and the deadbolt and her father's eyes on the floor. She told him about climbing back in the window for the map, about the 4 miles to the bus station, about the $11 ticket and the 9 miles in the dark on the county road. She told him about Clifton Paxton and the brown sedan and the 41 days in Cedar Ridge Holdings. She told him about the 8th letter and counting 6 stones up and 3 from the corner and pulling in the dark with her flashlight under her arm until the stone finally moved. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. Her hands sat folded in her lap, and she spoke in the level tone of someone who has spent the past several days getting very good at delivering difficult news to herself. Harlan Voss took notes on a yellow legal pad. His pen did not stop moving. He did not interrupt. When she got to Clifton Paxton and the 41 days, his pen lifted off the paper for the first time, and he looked at her. 41 days from when Paxton came to the cottage. "Yes, sir. That was 3 days ago now. So 38. He set the pen down. He folded his hands on the desk. He took a long breath that seemed to begin somewhere behind his collarbone. "All right, Miss Ashby. I am going to explain several things to you, and I am going to do it in plain language because this is your life and your land, and you deserve to understand it completely. You will stop me if anything is unclear." "Yes, sir." He laid his hand on the will first. The document your grandmother executed in this office on March 11th of 2001, witnessed by Cormac Eller and his late wife Edith, is a valid will under the laws of this state. It has been valid every day since the morning she signed it. A will does not become valid when it is filed with a court. It becomes valid when it is properly executed. Filing is only how the state learns of its existence after the fact. The affidavit your stepmother's attorney filed claiming your grandmother died without a will was either an error or a deliberate misrepresentation. As of this afternoon, it will be a misrepresentation of record. I am going to file this will with the probate court today. I am going to file an emergency petition and a motion to suspend all pending property transfers out of the estate. By close of business today, the sale your father signed will be void on its face. Wren sat very still. Do you understand what that means? He said. It means the cottage is mine. It means the cottage was always yours, he said, from the moment your grandmother died. The will specifies that no party related to your mother by marriage or step relation may claim any interest in the property. That is paragraph 7. Your grandmother underlined it herself. I initialed her underlining. We were both very serious about paragraph 7. He moved his hand to the wax canvas packet. Now, this is significantly more interesting than the will. He did not open it. He rested his hand on top of the canvas the way you rest a hand on something you want to be careful with. In 1957, your great-great-grandfather Cornelius Ashby drove 3 hours to the state capitol in a Ford pickup, made 2 filings at the state office, paid the fees in cash, and drove home without speaking of it to anyone in this valley except his wife and his daughter, who was your grandmother. Miriam was 19 years old at the time. He paused. The first filing was a registration of water rights on Hollow Creek, the spring-fed creek that runs along the back of the cottage property and goes underground for 3 miles before it surfaces again on what is now someone else's land. The second filing was a registration of mineral rights on a seam of high-grade silica sand running beneath approximately 2,300 acres of the valley floor. He stopped and looked at her. Silica sand, Wren said. High-grade silica sand, he said, is the primary raw material in optical glass. It is the primary raw material in fiber optic cable. It is increasingly the primary raw material in the manufacture of semiconductor wafers. The deposit under this valley is based on the geological surveys I have reviewed over the past 20 years among the largest high-purity deposits east of the Mississippi River. He let that sit for a moment. I cannot give you a precise dollar figure. That depends on extraction costs and royalty structures and variables above my expertise. What I can tell you is that a holding company does not quietly acquire 2,900 acres of surface land over 4 years at prices 40% below market value unless the number underneath that land is very large indeed. He opened the ledger then. He turned it to face her. Your great-great-grandfather placed the mineral and water rights into a trust in 1957. Your grandmother was named trustee. The trust required an annual renewal, filing a small administrative act to remain funded and active. Your grandmother made that renewal every year on January 1st. He turned the pages slowly. 62 entries. 62 years of January 1sts, each one in Miriam's careful handwriting. The ink different from decade to decade, darker in some years, thinner in others, but the hand always the same. Steady, unhurried, present. She did not miss one, Harlan said quietly. Not one in 62 years. Wren looked at the ledger and did not speak. Then he turned to a page near the back and set his finger on a line. You are named here Miss Ashby, by your full name, Wren Eleanor Ashby. Your grandmother amended the trust the year you were born to add you as a beneficiary. With your mother and your grandmother both deceased, you are the only living beneficiary of the Hollow Creek Mineral and Water Rights Trust. The clock on the wall behind him ticked twice. Cedar Ridge Holdings, he said, has been buying the surface of this valley for 4 years. They have been buying the frosting, Miss Ashby. The cake belongs to your family's trust, and now it belongs to you. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside in the courthouse square, a car passed. A door opened and closed somewhere below them in the hardware store. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning in a small county seat that did not yet know what was sitting in Harlan Voss's office on the second floor. "Sir," she said, "did my stepmother know about any of this when she married my father?" Harlan Voss was quiet. He looked at Cormac. Cormac looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has known the answer to a question for some time and has been waiting for it to be asked out loud. "Before I answer that, Harlan said I need to make a phone call. I would like to bring someone into this conversation. His name is Dale Pruitt. He spent 31 years in federal investigations before he retired. He lives about 40 minutes from here, and I think you should hear what he has to say before I answer your question." He picked up the phone. Dale Pruitt arrived in 50 minutes. He was 65 years old, square-shouldered with a gray beard trimmed close, and the build of a man who had worked outdoors in his youth, then sat behind a desk for a long time, and was now in retirement trying to correct the imbalance. He came in wearing a barn coat over a button-down shirt, and he shook Wren's hand with a grip that was firm and did not perform itself. He opened a thin manila folder and slid it across to Harlan, who read the top page for about 20 seconds, and then looked up at Wren over the rim of his glasses. "Your stepmother's maiden name is Crane," he said. "Sylvia Ann Crane. Before she married your father, she worked for 7 years as a senior paralegal at a law firm called Sterling Webb and Associates in the state capitol. They specialize in real estate and resource acquisition law. Their longest-standing client, going back nearly 12 years, is a Delaware holding company called Cedar Ridge Holdings." The clock on the wall ticked once. "She left the firm," Dale said, picking up in the steady, unhurried voice of someone who has spent a career delivering unwelcome facts to people who needed to hear them approximately 3 months before she began seeing your father. "She left in good standing. She never appeared in the public record on any Cedar Ridge transaction. Paralegals do not sign documents. They prepare the documents that other people sign." He paused. "But she would have known. She would have known about the silica seam. She would have known about Cedar Ridge's strategy of acquiring surface parcels, one at a time, over a period of years to avoid drawing attention. She would have known about the search the firm had been conducting for any severed mineral rights instrument that might affect the deposit. And she would have known when your grandmother died 7 years ago that the missing piece of this particular puzzle had been held by a woman named Miriam Ashby, whose surviving daughter had never opened probate." The room was quiet. Wren found that her hands had come up to cover her face. She had not asked them to do that. She sat with her palms against her eyes for a moment. "She married my father on purpose," she said into her hands. "Yes," said Harlan. "She came to the house with a casserole the day after my mother died. I am sorry, Miss Ashby." She lowered her hands. Her face was dry. Something inside her had shifted, rearranged itself around this new and terrible fact, and found a way to hold it without coming apart. She looked at Harlan Voss across the desk. "What do we do now?" she said. He smiled for the first time. A small, composed smile that barely moved the corners of his mouth but reached his pale eyes and stayed there. "Now, Miss Ashby," he said, "we go to work." In the days that followed, Wren did not wait. This was the thing that would matter later when she looked back on those 2 weeks between the opening of the box and the deposition. She had not sat at the cottage and waited for the old men to handle it. She had understood instinctively, the way her grandmother had apparently understood things instinctively, that waiting was its own kind of surrender, and she was done surrendering things she did not have to surrender. She spent the evenings at the oak table with the kerosene lamp turned up full and the wax canvas packet open in front of her. Most of the documents she could not fully parse. The legal language was dense, and the geological reports referenced survey coordinates and mineral assay units that meant nothing to her. But she read carefully, and she wrote down every word she did not understand in the yellow notebook Mrs. Aldine Harlan's secretary had given her. And she asked Harlan about each one in their daily phone calls from Cormac's kitchen, and slowly the picture came clear. She asked Cormac in the evenings about the valley, about the farms, about which families had sold in the past 4 years, and what had happened to them before the sale. Cormac sat across from her at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he told her what he knew, which was considerable, because a man who has farmed the same land for 43 years and bought his supplies from the same store and sat in the same church pew tends to know the shape of things in a way that someone who only looks at maps never can. 7 farms, he said. The Beckford place sold after the old man died, and his wife got a stack of letters from the assessor's office she could not make heads or tails of. The Granger property went after a piece of equipment was repossessed, and they got behind on their taxes by what turned out to be an accounting error, but by then they had already signed. The Whitmore land went after Mrs. Whitmore passed, and Earl was alone and could not manage the paperwork. Wren wrote it all down. Then she drew it. On a blank page in the back of the yellow notebook, she drew the valley from memory, rough and approximate, and she marked each farm that Cedar Ridge had acquired. And beside each one, she wrote the triggering event Cormac had described. When she looked at what she had drawn, she sat very still for a long moment. It was not a pattern of opportunity, it was a pattern of manufacture. Each triggering event had come after a period of confusion created by correspondence from the county assessor's office. Letters that escalated ordinary tax matters into apparent emergencies. Letters that frightened elderly farmers into decisions they would not otherwise have made. She brought the notebook to Harlan the next morning. He read what she had written and what she had drawn without speaking. He did not speak for a long time after he finished either. When he looked up, his river ice eyes had something in them she had not seen before. Something that was not quite surprise, but was close to its more serious cousin. "You found this yourself," he said. "I talked to Cormac. He knew the families." Harlan looked at the notebook again. Then he said quietly, as though to himself as much as to her, Cornelius Ashby's granddaughter. He picked up the phone and called Dale Pruitt. Cormac taught her to split wood in the afternoons in the hour before the light went. He showed her how to read the grain of a piece of oak before you brought the maul down. You looked for the place where the heartwood darkened against the sapwood. You set the wood with that seam facing up, and you aimed for it not at the center of the piece, but at the line where the wood was already asking to separate. The wood opened along that line the way a book opens along its spine when you know exactly where to apply pressure. She was bad at it the first day. The maul glanced off the side of a piece and she nearly dropped it. Cormac did not say anything. He picked up the piece, set it back on the block, and nodded at it. The second day, she was a little better. The third day, she split 4 pieces in a row without a miss. The fourth day, she set a length of oak on the block, read the heartwood seam in about 2 seconds, and came down clean. 2 pieces, both surfaces smooth. She stepped back. Cormac looked at the pieces. He looked at her. He gave one nod, the small, decisive kind, the kind that meant the matter was settled and no further discussion was required. She felt something warm move through her chest. Approval. The plain, unadorned weight of it. She had not felt it in a long time, and she had not known until that moment how much she had been carrying the absence of it. Sable Eller came to the cottage on the 9th day. She was Cormac's granddaughter, 16, with her grandfather's pale blue eyes and a wool coat 2 sizes too big that she wore with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, as though she had simply decided the coat was hers and the fit was a detail to be addressed later. She walked the half-mile from Cormac's farm in the early afternoon, carrying a thermos of hot tea and a book of crossword puzzles under her arm. And she knocked on the cottage door with the directness of someone who has been raised by a man who does not waste motion on social uncertainty. "You are Wren," she said. "Yes, I am Sable. My grandfather talks about you. In a good way. He does not talk in a good way about very many people." They sat on the hearthstones with the fire going and worked 2 crossword puzzles and drank tea and talked about the school in Linen Hollow. Who taught what? Who was fair and who was not? Where to sit in the cafeteria? Sable had her grandfather's quality of saying exactly what she meant without decoration and without apparent concern for how it landed, and Wren found this restful in a way she had not anticipated. She had been so long in the company of people who said things softly, who locked deadbolts quietly, who stood in hallways and looked at floors rather than at the people they were failing. The directness of the Eller family felt like stepping out of a room that had been short on air. When Sable left in the late afternoon, Wren stood in the doorway of the cottage and watched her walk back up the road through the maples. and she understood that she had just made the first real friend she had made in nearly 10 months. The thought sat with her warm and a little painful, the way things are when you have been without them long enough that their return feels like an ache before it feels like a comfort. On the 8th day, she went back to her father's house. She did not tell Cormac the real reason until she was already in the truck with him. She said she needed to retrieve some things she had left behind, her mother's photograph, and the letters still in the house, and a few other things. All of that was true. But the other reason, the one she did not say until they were 2 miles down the county road with the farms rolling past on either side, was that she needed to see Gerald. She needed to understand something about the night on the porch. Something that had been bothering her since the morning she had read Harlan's face when she asked about Sylvia. Cormac parked 2 houses down. She went around the side of the house the same route she had taken before. Sylvia's car was not in the driveway. Gerald's truck was. She went in through the bedroom window, which slid up with the same dry sound it had always made, and she moved through the silent house to the kitchen. Gerald Ashby was asleep at the kitchen table. It was 2:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday. He was sitting in his chair with his head on his folded arms and his coffee cup untouched at his elbow. The newspaper in front of him was folded back to the sports section. It was 3 days old. Wren stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her father. He was 46 years old and he looked 60. His hair had gone gray in a way she had not properly registered until this moment, standing still and looking at him without the distraction of motion or conversation. The skin beneath his eyes was the color of old paper. She looked slowly around the kitchen. Everything in its place, the dish rack by the sink, the hand towel folded on the counter, the bowl of apples that had always been there on the corner of the counter for as long as she could remember. Then she looked at the surface beside the coffee maker, a small amber prescription bottle. Pharmacy label turned toward the wall. She walked to it slowly. She picked it up. She turned the label toward herself and read it. The prescription was in Sylvia's name. The medication was a controlled sedative, a strong one. The prescribing physician was a doctor in private practice 90 miles away. The date of issue was 8 months ago. There had been 6 refills. Wren stood at the counter with the bottle in her hand and looked at her father sleeping at the kitchen table at 2:30 in the afternoon with a 3-day-old newspaper and an untouched cup of coffee, and she thought about the night on the porch, about the way he had stood behind Sylvia with his hand on the doorframe as though he needed it to hold himself upright, about his eyes on the floor. She had thought he was ashamed. She had thought he was weak. She had spent 9 days believing that her father had simply chosen not to look at her. She put the bottle back on the counter exactly as she had found it, labeled toward the wall. Then she took the disposable camera she had bought at Cormac's store out of her coat pocket, and she photographed the bottle where it stood. She photographed the kitchen. She photographed her father asleep at the table, the newspaper open to the wrong day, the coffee cup that had not been touched. She retrieved her mother's photograph from the shelf where Sylvia had moved it. She took the letter she had hidden in the dresser drawer inside an old envelope. She took her mother's small silver ring from the jewelry box. She went back to the kitchen. She stood beside her father's chair for a long moment. Then she leaned down and kissed him very gently on the top of his head, the way Eleanor used to do on Sunday mornings when he had fallen asleep over the paper. She said very quietly into his hair, "I am coming back for you, Daddy." Then she walked out. On the night of the 11th day, at a few minutes past 11, headlights swept across the boarded windows of the cottage. Wren was at the table with the trust documents when it happened. She heard the engine, heard the creak of a vehicle stopping on the unpaved track, heard the door. She set the documents down carefully and turned the kerosene lamp low. She did not move from the table. She sat in the near dark and she waited. Footsteps on the path. A knock on the cottage door. Not aggressive. Measured and formal, the knock of someone who has been told to be professional about this. "Miss Ashby, my name is not important. I represent the interests of Cedar Ridge Holdings. I think you and I can have a brief and productive conversation." She did not move. She did not go to the door. "I have a document here," he said, speaking through the door with the slightly elevated volume of someone addressing a room they cannot see into. It is a simple release of interest. You sign it, my client will arrange a payment of $50,000 in your name within 30 days. You keep the cottage. You walk away from the rest, and everyone moves forward. She sat in the low lamplight and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said through the door in a voice that she kept flat and even, "Tell your client the answer is no, and tell them that Harlan Voss knows you were here tonight." Silence outside. Then footsteps retreating down the path. The car door, the engine, the headlights sweeping back across the windows as the vehicle turned and went back down the track. And then just the wind in the maples and the fire settling low in the grate. Wren sat at the table. She pulled the yellow notebook toward her. She uncapped the pen. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote the date and the time. 11:14 in the evening. Then she wrote down everything. The sound of the engine on the track. The knock. Every word the man had said in the order he had said it. The sound of his footsteps on the path. The direction he had come from and the direction he left in. The vehicle a dark-colored sedan, and the partial plate number she had caught in the moment the headlights swept across the window. She wrote for 20 minutes without stopping until she had put down everything she could remember. Then she capped the pen and sat back and looked at what she had written. She did not call Cormac that night. She did not call Harlan. She sat with the notebook and the fire in the dark until the coals burned low, and then she climbed to the loft and lay under the cedar blankets in the cold. She was not frightened. She had been frightened on the porch in her wet socks. She had been frightened on the dark county road with 9 miles ahead of her and a flashlight that might give out. She had been frightened kneeling behind the chimney in the cold, pulling at a stone that would not move. She was past being frightened now. She was in the place on the other side of fear where things become very simple and very clear. In the morning, she walked to Cormac's and called Harlan from his kitchen. She read him every word from the notebook. When she finished, there was a silence on the line, and then Harlan Voss said in the quiet tone of a man who has just had a piece of information he needed confirm Miss Ashby. That visit just became their biggest mistake. "I will see you tomorrow morning." She walked back to the cottage in the early light with the notebook under her arm and the frost crackling under her feet and the maple standing bare and patient above the track. 6 days until the deposition. 32 days remaining of the original 41. The numbers no longer felt like a countdown. They felt like a timeline. There is a difference between those two things. A countdown is something running out. A timeline is something being built toward one careful day at a time. Wren Ashby set the notebook on the oak table beside the ammunition can and put the kettle on the wood stove and stood at the window and watched the morning come up over the eastern ridge, the way her grandmother must have watched it come up 10,000 mornings, from this same window, in this same kitchen, in this same house that had been sitting quietly in the trees for exactly this. The call came through Cormac's kitchen telephone on the morning of the 13th day. Wren was at the table with a cup of coffee and the yellow notebook open in front of her when Cormac came in from the barn and said quietly, "Your father is on the line." She set the cup down. She looked at the telephone on the wall for a moment before she stood up and crossed the kitchen and took the receiver. Gerald Ashby's voice came through it, thin and tired, the voice of a man speaking across a distance that had nothing to do with miles. "Emmy," he said. "Daddy." A long pause, the sound of him breathing, steadying himself the way a person does when they have something difficult to say and are making themselves say it anyway. "Dale Pruitt came to see me 2 days ago," he said. "He told me what they think she has been doing. I did not believe him at first. I sat with it for 2 days, and I could not make myself believe it because I did not want it to be true. Then yesterday morning, I went through the house, the medicine cabinet, the kitchen drawers, the pocket of her bathrobe hanging on the back of the bathroom door." He stopped. "I found 3 more bottles, Emmy. 3 more in places I never would have thought to look. I did not know they were there. I did not know any of it was there." Wren stood at the wall with the receiver against her ear, and Cormac standing at the window with his back turned, giving her what privacy the kitchen allowed. "I have been so tired," Gerald said, "for so long. Since before your mother died, if I'm being honest with myself. I thought it was grief. I thought it was my age. I thought there was something wrong with me, something broken that I could not locate or name. I did not think it was her. His voice tightened. I did not protect you the night she put you out. I stood in that hallway and I looked at the floor, and I did not protect my own daughter. I have been trying to understand why. I could not stand Emmy. I could barely keep myself upright. I thought I was weak. I thought I was failing you because I was weak. And now I know that I was not weak. And I need you to know that too, even if knowing it changes nothing about what I failed to do that night. Wren did not speak for a moment. She looked at the wall in front of her at a small frame photograph of Cormac and a woman she understood to be his late wife Edith, standing in front of the barn in some summer long gone, both of them squinting pleasantly into the light. I know, Daddy, she said. I am not asking you to forgive me, he said. I do not have the right to ask you for anything right now. I am only telling you that I am here, whenever you are ready, however long that takes. She held the phone and felt the crack that had been forming in the numbness since the morning she kissed him on the top of his head open a little further. Not enough to break through, but enough to feel what was on the other side of it, warm and complicated, and not yet ready to be named. I am not ready yet, she said, but I will be. We have the deposition the day after tomorrow. After that, you and I are going to talk. All right, Emmy, he said. All right. She hung up the receiver. She stood at the wall for a moment, then she turned and went back to the table and picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands until the warmth moved through her palms. Cormac did not turn from the window for another full minute. When he did, he looked at her with the calm, unhurried attention he gave to most things. He said, biscuits in the warmer if you want them. She ate 2 biscuits with butter. She drank a second cup of coffee. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lay in a long, pale bar across the yellow tablecloth. And she sat in it and thought about her father's voice on the telephone and about the 3 bottles he had found in places he had never thought to look. Dale Pruitt had called Harlan the previous week with the laboratory results. The hair sample they had taken from Gerald, which could register drug presence going back several months, had come back unambiguous. He had been ingesting a controlled sedative in steadily increasing amounts for at least 6 months, most likely longer. He had not known. The prescription was technically Sylvia's, issued by a doctor 90 miles away after a single appointment that had never been followed up. 6 refills by mail. The dosage on the label bore no particular relationship to what Gerald had actually been receiving. You cannot administer a controlled substance to another person without their knowledge or consent. Dale had said on the phone to Harlan, and Harlan had related to Wren the same afternoon. That is a felony under the laws of this state, regardless of the marital relationship, regardless of whose name appears on the prescription. The pattern of concealment, the multiple bottles in separate locations throughout the house, converts the question of intent from uncertain to resolved. Harlan had filed the relevant materials with the district attorney's office that same week. The DA was a man named Robert Ferris, who had held the office for 11 years, and Dale had gone to high school with Ferris and had spoken to him directly. The conversation had gone the way Harlan had expected it to go. 2 days until the deposition. 6 days until charges would be filed. Wren spent those 2 days the way she had spent most of the past 2 weeks, reading and writing and asking questions and refusing to sit still. She read through the wax canvas packet one more time from beginning to end, and she wrote a clean summary in the yellow notebook of every document and what it established. She did it not because Harlan needed her to, but because she needed to understand it completely herself in her own words. Before she walked into that conference room and sat across a table from people whose entire professional lives had been built on understanding these things better than she did. On the evening before the deposition, Harlan's secretary, Mrs. Aldine, arrived at the cottage in a small hatchback with a casserole dish in a paper bag from a thrift store in the county seat. The bag held 3 changes of clothes in Wren's size. A wool sweater the color of cranberries, a pair of dark corduroy trousers, a flannel shirt worn soft by whoever had owned it before. You cannot walk into a deposition looking like a girl who has been sleeping in a barn jacket, Mrs. Aldine said, without any particular unkindness. She set the casserole on the table and patted Wren's arm once and drove back down the track without making a production of it. Wren held the cranberry sweater up in the lamplight and looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully over the back of the chair and climbed up to the loft. She slept 6 hours, which was more than she had expected. The deposition was scheduled for 10 o'clock on the morning of the 18th day in the large conference room on the second floor of Harlan Voss's building. Cormac drove her. The farm report was playing on the AM station when he started the truck, and he turned it off after about 30 seconds without comment. They drove east on the county road with the early morning light coming low and flat across the November fields. The kind of light that makes everything look as though it has been there since the beginning and intends to remain. Wren sat with the yellow notebook on her knee and did not open it. She had read it enough times. She knew what was in it. The conference room had a long oak table with 10 chairs arranged around it, a sideboard with a coffee service, and a pitcher of water and a stack of plain white napkins and walls paneled in the same dark wood as the waiting room. On the wall behind the chair where Harlan would sit hung a single-frame document, a copy of the original county charter from 1802 signed by 17 men, 2 of whose surnames were Voss. Harlan had hung it there 46 years ago when he first took the office and had never moved it. Wren and Cormac arrived first. Dale Pruitt was already there standing at the sideboard with a cup of coffee. He shook Wren's hand and looked at her with the evaluating attention of someone checking the readiness of something that has been in preparation for a long time. "How are you?" he said. "Ready," she said. He nodded once. That was enough for both of them. Harlan Voss came in at 5 minutes to 10, carrying his leather satchel and wearing the same dark suit he appeared to own in multiple identical versions. He set the satchel on the table. He looked at Wren. He said, "Miss Ashby, you know your job today." "Yes, sir. Tell me." "Sit beside you. Answer direct questions in clear, short sentences. Say, 'I do not know,' when I do not know." "That is exactly right," he said. "Everything else is my job. And I have been doing my job in this county since before Mr. Pruitt was born." Dale, who was 65, said nothing. He poured himself a second cup of coffee. Cedar Ridge Holdings sent 3 lawyers. Wren heard them on the stairs before she saw them. The particular sound of expensive shoes on a wooden staircase, confident and unhurried, the sound of people accustomed to arriving last and still controlling the room. The lead attorney came through the door first. Reginald Sterling was 52 years old, the son of the founding Sterling and Sterling Webb and Associates, and he wore a suit that had been made for him specifically charcoal gray that absorbed the office light without reflecting it. Silver cufflinks, a pocket square the pale blue of a winter sky. He had the build and bearing of someone who had been told from an early age that the room would arrange itself around him, and who had found this to be consistently true across a long and successful career. The 2 attorneys with him were younger. One carried a leather portfolio, the other carried a laptop, and had the slightly anxious expression of someone responsible for technology in an environment that viewed technology with measured distrust. Sterling shook Harlan's hand. He shook Dale's. He shook Wren's and gave her a brief professional smile that stopped precisely at his cheekbones. "Miss Ashby, I am sorry for the circumstances that bring us here today." "Yes, sir," she said. They sat, Harlan at the head of the table, Wren to his right, Cormac to her right because she had asked him to be there, and Harlan had seen no reason to refuse. Dale to Cormac's right, Sterling across from Harlan, his 2 attorneys flanking him. A court reporter at a small separate table along the wall with her hands resting lightly on the keys of her machine. Sterling opened his portfolio. He spoke for about 10 minutes. He was very good at it, fluid and precise and thoroughly calibrated. And what he said amounted to this. There had been irregularities in how Cedar Ridge's previous counsel had handled due diligence on the Valley acquisitions. The affidavit asserting intestacy had been prepared in good faith on the basis of the public record. As it existed at the time, the company was naturally prepared to be reasonable in light of new information. The trust documents, while interesting, raised certain questions of standing that he was confident could be addressed through good faith dialogue, and there was, he was sure, a number somewhere that could make everyone in this room comfortable and allow them all to move forward productively. He closed the portfolio. He folded his hands on top of it. He looked at Harlan Voss with the expression of a man who has made this particular opening statement in many rooms, exactly like this one, and knows precisely what comes next. Harlan did not move for a moment. Then he reached down beside his chair and lifted his leather satchel onto the table. He opened it and began to remove documents. He placed them on the table one at a time without hurry, the way a careful craftsman lays out tools before a long and particular job. The will of Miriam Eleanor Ashby, he said, executed in this office on March 11th, 2001. Witnessed by Cormac Elijah Eller and Edith May Eller, both of Linen Hollow. Drafted by me. Filed with the probate court of this county on the 7th of this month. Valid under the laws of this state from the moment of its execution. Not from the moment of filing, from the moment of execution. I would like that distinction to be clearly understood before we proceed any further. He placed the second document, the trust instrument creating the Hollow Creek Mineral and Water Rights Trust. Executed in 1957, funded with the water rights registered with the state office on the 22nd of August, 1957, and the mineral rights registered on the 23rd. Renewable annually by the named trustee. Renewed without interruption every January 1st from 1957 through 2019 by Miriam Ashby. 62 renewals. Not one missed. A third document. State certification of the water rights registration. Continuous and uninterrupted from 1957 to the present. A fourth. State certification of the mineral rights registration. Continuous and uninterrupted from 1957 to the present. Severed from the surface estate. Recorded in the county registry by Cornelius Ashby in person on the 23rd of August, 1957. Paid for in cash, witnessed by two men whose signatures I have authenticated through the County Historical Society archive at some effort over the past week. A fifth. A preliminary geological report prepared at my request by Dr. Constance Whitley of the Department of Geological Sciences at the State University, who spent 6 days reviewing regional surveys at my request. Dr. Whitley estimates the recoverable high-purity silica deposit beneath the relevant acreage at between 2.8 and 3.4 million tons, depending on extraction method. At current market prices for Grade 1 optical quality silica, that range corresponds to a gross resource value of between $420 million and $510 million before extraction costs and royalty structures. The room was very quiet. The court reporter's fingers had not moved since the second document. She was simply listening. A sixth. A spreadsheet prepared by Mr. Pruitt. 11 surface transactions completed by Cedar Ridge Holdings, or its named subsidiaries in this valley over the past 4 years. Total acreage acquired 2,947 acres. Total purchase price paid $11.3 million. Average price per acre, $3,834, which is, I will note for the record, approximately 40% of the agricultural appraisal value for comparable parcels in adjacent counties over the same period. A discount which I am sure the company can explain to a federal court if given the opportunity. He paused, and finally he said, and placed the last documents on the table with the same unhurried precision he had used for all the others. A series of 7 letters sent from the office of the county tax assessor to 7 property owners whose parcels were subsequently acquired by Cedar Ridge Holdings or its subsidiaries. Each of these letters was generated from an administrative template embedded in software provided to that office as pro bono work by Sterling Webb and Associates 8 years ago. Each letter contains language that, while technically accurate when read in isolation, was constructed to create the impression of urgent tax delinquency where no such delinquency existed under any reasonable interpretation of the relevant statutes. 3 of the 7 original property owners are still living. I have spoken to all 3 of them in the past 10 days. They have agreed to provide sworn statements regarding the timing and tone of the correspondence they received and the pressure that correspondence placed on them to liquidate their family land. He set one more page on top of the stack. And this. A written record of events occurring on the night of the 11th day of this month at 11:14 in the evening at the property of Wren Eleanor Ashby on Hollow Creek Road. Written by Miss Ashby herself in her own hand within 30 minutes of the events described, including a partial plate number for the vehicle involved. He folded his hands. "Mr. Sterling," he said, and his voice had not changed in register or speed or volume. "From the first word to the last, I have been a member of the bar in this county for 54 years. I served 3 terms as elected county prosecutor between 1974 and 1986. I have argued before the state Supreme Court 4 times and I have not lost. I am 79 years old, and by the standards of my profession, I am a small man practicing a small kind of law in a small county seat." He let that sit for a moment. "I do not bluff. I have never bluffed in 54 years of practice. I do not bring cases I cannot win. So I am going to offer you a choice, and I am going to offer it exactly once, and I would like you to take whatever time you need before you answer me." Sterling had not moved. His portfolio sat closed under his folded hands. The pale blue pocket square moved very slightly with his breathing. "Choice 1, Harlan said. Your client continues to contest the trust. In that event, the next phase of this matter will involve depositions of every named officer of Cedar Ridge Holdings, subpoenas of all internal communications touching on this valley. For the past 4 years, the sworn testimony of 3 living elderly farmers and the heirs of 4 deceased ones regarding letters designed to pressure them into premature sales of their family land, and a referral to the United States Attorney's Office on a fact pattern that in my professional judgment satisfies the predicate acts requirement of federal racketeering statutes. That route will occupy the next 4 to 6 years of all of our lives. At the end of it, your client will in the best case lose. In the worst case, individuals associated with your client will face federal indictment." He paused. "Choice 2. Your client recognizes the trust. Your client negotiates in good faith with this office a fair royalty structure for any future extraction of silica from any surface parcels legitimately acquired in this valley. Your client makes restitution to the 7 affected families for the difference between prices paid and fair market value at the time of sale. Your client ceases all further property acquisitions in this valley for a period of 10 years. Your client pays Miss Ashby's legal fees in full, and we all go home this afternoon to our families who I imagine are tired of waiting for us." He unfolded his hands. "Which would you prefer, Mr. Sterling?" The conference room was absolutely still. Outside in the courthouse square, a car moved along the street. Somewhere in the building below, a door opened and closed. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary November morning in a town that did not yet fully understand what was being decided above it. Reginald Sterling looked at the documents arranged on the table in front of him. He looked at them for a long time, taking each stack in turn, the way a man reads a situation he has found himself in and is trying to identify the exits. Then he looked at Harlan Voss. Then, and this was the moment Wren would carry with her for the rest of her life, his eyes moved to her. Just for a second, just long enough for something to register in them that had not been there when he walked in. Not friendliness, not apology, something older and more reluctant than either of those. The expression of a man who came into a room expecting one thing and found another and is honest enough with himself to acknowledge the difference. He turned to the attorney with the portfolio and spoke in a low voice. Then he looked at Harlan. "We are going to need a few minutes." "Take all the time you require," Harlan said. "Mrs. Aldine has set up the room down the hall. There is coffee." The Cedar Ridge attorneys were out of the room for 57 minutes. Wren sat at the conference table and drank a glass of water and did not speak much. Cormac sat beside her with his hands resting on the table and looked at the county charter on the wall. Dale Pruitt read something on a legal pad. Harlan Voss sat with his eyes closed and his hands folded in his lap, and might have been asleep or might have been doing something else entirely that simply resembled sleep from the outside. At one point, Cormac said, without looking away from the charter on the wall, "Your great-great-grandfather paid for those filings in cash." "Yes, sir," Wren said. "Drove 6 hours round trip to the Capitol. Never told a soul in this valley except his wife and his daughter. She looked at the side of his face. Some people, Cormac said, understand that the most important things they will ever do are the things that will not be known about or appreciated for a generation or two. They do them anyway. That is a particular kind of character. It is not common. The door at the end of the hall opened. Footsteps in the corridor. Reginald Sterling came back into the conference room alone. He did not sit down. He stood at his place at the table and he looked at Harlan Voss, and then he said, "Choice 2, Mr. Voss." Harlan opened his eyes. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," he said. "We have work to do." The deposition lasted 4.5 hours. By the time it ended, the framework of an agreement had been written out in longhand on legal pads and initialed in 6 places by Reginald Sterling and in 6 places by Harlan Voss. Cedar Ridge Holdings would recognize the Hollow Creek Mineral and Water Rights Trust in full. Cedar Ridge Holdings would negotiate in good faith a royalty structure for any future silica extraction, structured to remain in effect for the life of the deposit and to benefit the trust's named beneficiaries and their lawful descendants. Cedar Ridge Holdings would make restitution to the 7 affected families. Cedar Ridge Holdings would cease all property acquisitions in the valley for 10 years. Cedar Ridge Holdings would pay Ren Ashby's legal fees in their entirety. When Sterling and his attorneys had gathered their materials and left the building, the sound of expensive shoes descending the wooden staircase one last time, Harlan Voss sat back in his chair and closed his eyes and was still for almost a full minute. Then he opened them and looked at Ren. "We are not finished," he said. "No, sir. There is still the matter of your father." "Yes, sir." Dale Pruitt set a folder on the table. "Charges," he said, "will be filed on Monday morning. Robert Ferris has reviewed everything I have given him. The DA does not move slowly on this kind of matter, and neither does the court. Once it begins, it will move quickly." He paused. "I would like to ask you something, Miss Ashby." "You do not have to answer." She looked at him. "Do you want to be there?" he said when she is told. Wren sat with that for a moment. The late afternoon light was coming through the window of the conference room at a low angle, the short November light that does not last and does not try to lying across the oak table and the initialed legal pads and the empty water glasses. "Yes," she said. "I want to be the one who tells her." Harlan looked at Dale. Dale looked at Harlan. Then Harlan said, "We will arrange it." They arranged it for Friday afternoon. Gerald would ask Sylvia to sit down with him in the living room of the house at 3 o'clock. Dale and a sheriff's deputy named Garrett would be parked at the end of the block in an unmarked car. Wren and Cormac would arrive at the house at 3:15. Gerald's job was to keep Sylvia in the living room. The deputy's job was to wait. Wren's job was to say what needed to be said. On Thursday evening, the night before Wren walked to the cemetery alone. She had been once before with Cormac in those first 2 weeks. She went this time by herself in the early dark after supper with a flashlight, in the barn jacket and the cold coming down off the ridge, carrying the first real smell of snow, the promise of winter that had been building for days. She walked the gravel path past the older stones with their carved willows, and 19th century dates, past the veterans' markers with their small flags, past her great-great-grandparents lying side by side under a granite slab, until she came to the slate stone at the back under the bare maple. Miriam Eleanor Ashby, the dates. And below them in smaller letters she tended it. Wren knelt down. She put her hand flat on the stone. It was very cold. A few last maple leaves came down, and one of them landed on the slate and stayed there a small dark shape against the gray. "I've found the box," she said quietly. "I found the will and the ledger and the trust. I read everything. I went to Harlan Voss, and I sat at the table, and I listened, and then I went back to the cottage, and I read it again until I understood every part of it myself. I found the pattern in the valley before Dale Pruitt did, and I brought it to Harlan in a notebook. Cormac told me later that Harlan said Cornelius Ashby's granddaughter when he read it. He said it quietly like it was meant for himself. But Cormac heard. She was quiet for a moment. "Somebody came to the cottage at night," she said. They knocked on the door and offered me $50,000 to sign a piece of paper and walk away. I did not open the door. I told them to tell their client the answer was no and that Harlan Voss knew they had been there. Then I sat down and wrote everything into my notebook before I could forget any of it. The wind moved through the bare maple above her. "Tomorrow I'm going to stand in the living room of my father's house," she said, "and I am going to look Sylvia Crane in the face and tell her what has happened and what is coming. I am going to do it because she did not tell me on the porch that night in October. She only locked the door and turned out the light. I am doing it differently." She stayed like that with her hand on the stone until the cold had gone deep into her palm and her knees were stiff from the ground. Then she stood up and said very quietly to the stone and the maple and the dark and whatever else might be listening in a country graveyard at night, "I will tend it." She walked back through the dark to the cottage and she slept. Friday came cold and clear, a hard frost on the ground overnight, the grass silver and stiff, the last leaves gone from the maples along Hollow Creek Road, and the branches bare and precise against the pale sky. Cormac parked 2 houses down from the Ashby house at 3:10. He and Wren walked up the sidewalk side by side at a measured pace, the pace of people who have decided not to hurry the last steps of something. The front door was unlocked. Wren opened it and walked in. Gerald was in his old chair in the living room. He was thinner than he had sounded on the phone. His hands were folded in his lap, and he was sitting with the particular deliberate stillness of a man who is managing himself carefully through a difficult stretch of time. When Wren came through the door, something moved in his face, a loosening like a weight that has been held too long in one position finally being allowed to shift. Sylvia was on the couch across from him. She was wearing the navy cardigan, the one she had worn to Eleanor Ashby's funeral on a gray morning 9 months and some weeks ago. Whether she had chosen it consciously or not, Wren could not know, but she noticed it the moment she came through the door, and the noticing settled something in her, some last small uncertainty about what she was doing here and what it required of her. Sylvia turned when she heard the door. She saw Wren. She saw Cormac Eller standing at the entrance to the room, tall and quiet in his flannel work shirt, not coming further in, simply present, a kind of wall made of flannel and 43 years of farming the land next door. Something in Sylvia's face went very careful. Wren crossed the room. She sat down in the chair beside her father. She did not look at Sylvia yet. She looked at Gerald, and she placed her hand over his, and she felt his fingers close around hers and felt a small tremor in them that he could not entirely suppress. "Daddy," she said, "are you all right?" "Better," he said. "Better every day." "Good." She turned then. She looked at Sylvia Crane Ashby across the living room of the house where Wren had grown up, the room where Eleanor had read to her in front of the fireplace when she was small, the room where Gerald had taught her to fold a paper airplane on a rainy Saturday when she was 6, the room where her mother's watercolor of Hollow Creek had hung above the mantel for 15 years before Sylvia had taken it down and replaced it with a print of a sailboat that meant nothing to anyone in that house. She looked at her stepmother with the expression Miriam Ashby had worn in the cottage doorway in 1971 when she had told the man from the mining concern that the land was not for sale. Wren did not know she was wearing it. She had never seen it on her own face, but it had come down to her through Eleanor, who had absorbed it from Miriam without knowing it was happening, and through the photograph on the cottage mantel, and through 62 years of January 1st in a leather ledger kept by a woman who understood that character is demonstrated in the small, repeated acts of a lifetime and nowhere else. Wren wore it now the way a person wears something that has always belonged to them and has simply been waiting in a drawer. "I know about Sterling Webb and Associates," she said. "I know about your 7 years there as a senior paralegal. I know about Cedar Ridge Holdings and the file they kept internally under the name Ashby Mineral Gap, a file that existed 2 years before my mother died. I know what you knew when you started seeing my father. I know what you knew when you came to our house with a casserole the day after my mother's funeral." Sylvia did not speak. "I know what you have been doing to my father in this house for at least the past 8 months. We have the medical records. We have the results of a laboratory hair analysis that is not ambiguous. We have 4 prescription bottles recovered from locations throughout this house, 3 of which you placed where you expected no one would ever look. We have records from the pharmacy documenting 6 refills on a prescription that was issued to you after a single appointment with a doctor 90 miles from here, whom you never saw again. She paused. The deposition was Tuesday. Cedar Ridge has settled. The trust is recognized by all parties. The cottage and the 41 acres surrounding it are mine by the explicit terms of a will that your attorney told a probate court did not exist. The silica rights are mine. The water rights are mine. Harlan Voss is 79 years old, and in 54 years of practice, he has not lost a case he believed in. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The district attorney's office will be filing criminal charges on Monday morning. Dale Pruitt is parked at the end of this block with a sheriff's deputy. They have everything they need. She let a moment of silence go by, not for effect, but because what she was about to say was the part that mattered most to her, and she wanted it to stand on its own. I asked to be the one who told you, she said. I asked because you did not tell me on the porch that night in October. You did not sit me down and explain what was happening and why. You made a decision about my life and my father and my family's land, and you communicated it with a turn of a deadbolt and a porch light going out. You gave me nothing. You only locked the door. She looked at Sylvia steadily. I am doing it differently. I am standing in front of you and telling you to your face what has happened and what is coming before the deputy walks up to this door. That is the courtesy you did not give me. I am giving it to you anyway, because I was raised by people who believe that how you do a thing matters, even when the thing is hard, and I intend to keep being the kind of person they raised. Sylvia Crane Ashby sat very still on the couch. Her coffee cup was on the side table beside her. It was trembling faintly, the small vibration that comes from a person's controlled stillness rather than any movement. She set it down carefully. Then she straightened the navy cardigan. A composed, deliberate gesture. The adjustment of a collar, the smoothing of a cuff. The action of someone who has decided that posture is the last form of dignity available to them and intends to maintain it. She looked at Gerald. Gerald, she said. Her voice was soft. It had always been soft. That had always been part of it. Gerald looked at her across the room. He looked at her with eyes that were his own for the first time in a long time, clear and tired and certain of what they were seeing. Sylvia, he said, get out of my house, please. You can walk out with what dignity you have left, or you can wait for the deputy to come to the door. I do not care which. Sylvia stood up. She stood slowly, smoothing the cardigan once more as she rose. She picked up her purse from beside the couch. She walked to the front hall closet and took down her coat and put it on, with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who has decided that how they leave a room is the only thing left they can control. She picked up her keys. She walked to the front door. Cormac stepped back from the doorway to let her pass. She paused with her hand on the frame and her back to the room. It was more complicated than that, she said. Then she opened the door and walked down the porch steps and down the front walk in the pale November light. Dale Pruitt was standing at the bottom of the walk with his hands in his coat pockets. The deputy named Garrett was getting out of the unmarked car at the curb. The afternoon light was flat and without favor, and it fell equally on the street and the bare trees and the woman in the navy cardigan walking toward men who had been waiting for her at the end of a path she had laid for herself, one careful, calculated step at a time. Wren stood at the living room window with her hand on her father's shoulder and watched. She watched without expression, not because she felt nothing, but because what she felt was too large and too layered to fit on a face. She watched Sylvia Crane reach the end of the walk. She watched Dale say something she could not hear through the glass. She watched the deputy open the rear door of the car, and she watched the navy cardigan disappear into the back seat, and she watched the car pull away from the curb and move down the street and turn the corner and go. The street was empty. The maples stood bare along both sides of it. Somewhere up the block, a door opened briefly, and a dog came out and then went back in, and the door closed again. Gerald's hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his shoulder. His grip was still uncertain, still rebuilding itself, but it was there and it was his. Emmy, he said. Daddy. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something that has been a long time coming has finally arrived and passed through, and what remains is simply the ordinary silence of a house. Cormac stood in the hallway and did not move and did not speak. He had the quality particular to people who have spent their lives in close attention to things that move slowly and cannot be hurried of being present without pressing. He stood where he was, and he let the room be what it needed to be. It was Gerald who finally spoke. He said, I have been trying to remember the last time I looked at you. The last time I really looked. She said it was before Mama got sick. Before everything. He nodded slowly. Before everything. He looked down at their hands. I lost a long time, Emmy. A long time I am not going to get back. You are here now, she said. He looked up at her. Are you staying tonight? She thought about the cottage, the cold hearthstones in the early morning, and the hand pump, and the cedar blankets in the loft, and the photograph of Miriam on the mantel, looking straight at the camera with the expression of a woman who has work to do. She thought about the kettle on the wood stove, and the view out the window over the frost-covered clearing, and the sound the maples made when the wind came down from the ridge in the dark. Not tonight, she said, but I will come back. We will have time. We will figure out the rest of it. He nodded. He held her hand a little tighter and then released it, and she picked up her jacket from the back of the chair where she had set it, and she looked at him once more, and then she walked out to the hall where Cormac was waiting. In the truck going back, the farm report was playing on the AM station when Cormac started the engine. Corn futures. Soybean futures. A cold front moving in from the northwest, temperatures dropping through the weekend, first significant snowfall of the season expected by Sunday morning. Cormac listened to the weather for a moment. Then he turned the radio off. He said your grandmother split her last cord of wood in the September before she died. 3 cords total. She was 85 years old, and she laid in every stick of it herself. Wren looked out the window at the fields passing in the fading afternoon light, the harvested rows and the bare hedgerows, and the sky going pale above the eastern hills. She knew she was not going to see that winter, Cormac said. She split it anyway. She told me that September, she said somebody is going to need this wood. She did not know who. She did not ask. She just knew somebody would, and she split it. The truck rolled on. The hills rose and fell. The bare maples on either side of the road held their empty arms up against the sky in the particular way of trees in November, patient and without apology for what they have let go. When they reached Hollow Creek Road and turned up the unpaved track toward the cottage, the clearing was already in shadow, the maples having lost the last of the evening light. But the cottage stood where it had always stood, solid and square in the gathering dark, the chimney rising against the tree line. The stone walls, the color of the creek, they had been carried up from 135 years ago by a man with a team of horses and a clear idea of what he was building and why. Wren got out of the truck. She stood in the clearing for a moment and looked at the place. She could see from where she stood the spot at the back of the chimney where 2 stones had been pulled out and set on the ground on a cold October night and not yet replaced. She would need to remortar them. She had been reading about the right mix, the proper way to seed old stone, so it would hold for another 100 years, and Cormac had said he would show her what she could not learn from reading. There was wood enough for the winter, 3 cords dry in season. The hand pump worked, the lamp had oil, the roof leaked at one corner and she would fix it before the snow came, and she had been reading about that too. She went inside. She built up the fire from the coals that had been banking all day. She put the kettle on. She took her grandmother's leather ledger from the ammunition can and set it on the oak table under the lamp, and she opened it to the last page of entries. 62 years of January 1sts in Miriam's hand, the ink varying across the decades, but the hand always steady, always present, always there. She turned to the next blank page. She did not write anything. It was November, not January, and she understood, without needing to be told, that some things have their proper season and should not be rushed or moved out of it. She would write her first entry on January 1st the way Miriam had done, the way Cornelius had done before Miriam, in the understanding that the small, faithful acts of a lifetime are invisible in any single year, and become across enough years the only things that endure. She closed the ledger. She sat back in her grandmother's chair. The fire moved in the grate, and the wind came off the ridge and moved through the bare maples outside, and the cottage held against it the way a thing holds that has never needed anyone's permission to stand quietly and without drama, doing the only work it has ever been asked to do. On the mantel above the fire, Miriam Ashby looked straight at the camera in the faded photograph. A wooden bucket in one hand, a clearing full of October light behind her. Not smiling, not frowning. The face of a woman who has work to do and intends to do it, and has arranged her life in every detail she could arrange so that the work would continue after she was gone. Wren looked at her grandmother's face for a long time. Then she turned up the lamp, pulled the yellow notebook toward her, and got to work.